So, okay. So, yeah. So this talk is based on Pablo's book, which was published by Foha Productions. And we're working on chapters 6, communication with the higher consciousness, and chapter 7, evolution of the higher ego. So if you have the book, that's what we'll be going by.
Mm-hmm. So the question of the soul is an important one, but the word soul is used in many different ways in different traditions. So let us start by looking at the constitution of human beings from a more simple point of view, and then how theosophy elaborates it.
So in the West and early Christianity, this is what we knew as growing up or as younger. All right, that there's a spirit, a soul, and a body. So the body is the corruptible part, the original sin, okay, the material aspect, or I think Blavatsky calls it terrestrial. She uses the word terrestrial sometimes. The spirit is the part that is divine and incorruptible. And then the soul, being the intermediary, can be corrupted by the body or inspired or elevated by the spirit. And obviously our goal as humanity, or especially as Theosophists, is that we hang out with the spirit more than we hang out with the body.
Mm-hmm. So then the Theosophical tradition begins to elaborate a little on this idea of the soul and the body also, but we are not going to look into that too much. The body has 3 aspects, and the soul also has 3 aspects, and then we have the spirit. So the septenary constitution comes from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we describe a little the soul?
Right. So then I guess what we did was highlight here the 4, 5, and 6, the animal soul, the human soul, and the spiritual soul. So we could go back to what we did in our threefold constitution and say that the animal soul is the more materialistic, instinctive, corruptible part of the human nature, and the spiritual soul is the more divine, inspirational, perfect part. And then the human soul, which we will see in the next slide, does the same thing. It can be either dragged down by the animal soul or lifted up by the spiritual soul. And once again, our goal of evolution is to hang out with the spiritual soul.
So you see that Theosophy proposes like a system of bridges, because there is, even in the West, there is the idea of how can the mind, if the mind is not material, interact with the body that is material. You know, Descartes proposed this duality, and modern philosophy tends to be suspicious of that. What Theosophy proposes is that there are always intermediate principles that share a little of both, of the one that is higher and the one that is lower, and sharing both natures, then it can connect them. So we see the soul as a whole as a connector, then the soul has 3 aspects and the middle one as a connector, and we have that throughout the whole constitution.
And although the talk isn't about this today, you can see that also in 1, 2, and 3, the aspects of the physical body, that the astral double is the connector or the bridge between the vitality and the body. And we'll see the Sanskrit terms next. So here we see the Sanskrit words, Sanskrit words to those that we just gave you in English. So spirit, Atman, spiritual soul, Buddhi, human soul, Manas, and then that breaks into higher Manas and lower Manas, the animal soul, Kama, vitality, Prana, astral double, Linga Sharira, and the body, the Stula Sharira.
If you are going to study theosophical literature, you need to get familiar with the Sanskrit terms, because Blavatsky and early theosophists found that in the West, all these words, soul, spirit, etc., are used in very different ways. So they wanted a terminology that was more accurate. And Blavatsky chose to use the Sanskrit language. Again, even in Sanskrit, many of these terms are used differently in different schools, but at least within the Theosophical tradition, those Sanskrit terms are more unifying, and then we can translate those Sanskrit terms in different ways, like the animal soul can be also translated as passional nature, or desire nature, etc. So it's important to be familiar with the Sanskrit if you are studying theosophy.
Right. And then even within, and we'll see as we kind of zoom in and elucidate more and more this blue section, we'll see that Blavatsky tends to use definitions that are particular to theosophy for what they mean, and that always throws me off, especially this part that we're going to go over today, because when the words are used in Blavatsky's terms, that's one thing, but then when you're talking and you use the word, and I'm specifically here, I'm thinking of the word individual, which we will go on to see. That is, it's confusing. It's confusing, mm-hmm. And I always have to stop and think, okay, wait, where am I and how am I using this word? So I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah, in general, every philosopher has to define his or her own terms, because as we said, words don't have an absolute term. And we don't have words for spiritual processes. Most of our language is developed out of the material reality. So we always have to keep in mind, what does this author mean by consciousness or awareness or things like that. Even the Sanskrit buddhi, Blavatsky uses it in a way that is different from how Hinduism uses it. In Hindu, for example, in typical Vedanta teaching, buddhi is closer to higher manas than the way we understand buddhi in theosophy. So you always have to keep that in mind when talking about words.
Okay, so here now we have added the vehicles. So I'm just going to focus on the darker blue part. So our spiritual soul, Sanskrit name is buddhi. It's also called the spiritual ego. The human soul, manas, we have higher and lower. Higher is the higher ego, and the lower with comma is the lower ego or the psyche. Now, the difference here is that what we have is the principles are, or the souls are the passive principle. It's devoid of self-consciousness, that I-ness, the knowing. And when we get to the vehicles, what we've done, or what has happened, is the egos are the active principle, which shows that self-consciousness or the sense of I-ness is there.
Yeah, you will see that. Of course, Blavatsky was never very systematic in her writings, because she didn't get all this information as a philosophy with well-defined words. She says that all that she learned was in higher states of consciousness, and you learn them without words. So then you have to put all this in words. And she wasn't very systematic, but in general, she uses these words in that way. The ego is the active vehicle of consciousness. As we are going to see, this is very important for the spiritual soul. In most of us, buddhi is latent, and therefore is a soul, is a possibility. When we realize the buddhic nature, then it becomes an ego in the sense of a self-conscious principle. And we will see this as we go on. All right, so let's continue.
Okay, so manas, the reincarnating soul. So the first part of this talk is what we're going to focus on, specifically manas and its two aspects, its higher nature and its lower nature. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so the higher ego, manas. The higher ego is highly spiritual and is linked very closely with the higher principles, buddhi and atman. Try to imagine a spirit, a celestial being, whether we call it by one name or another, divine in its essential nature, yet not pure enough to be one with the all. So the true eternal manas is what is depicted here as higher manas, or the higher ego. And it naturally dwells, its natural environment is the higher mental plane. And manas on its own plane is a spiritual entity without limitations, without conditionings that usually come from, or that come from the personality. Its natural tendency is to move towards Buddhi, and it is the true essence of who we really are.
Yes, when Blavatsky uses the word ego or ego, the word comes from the Greek ego, which simply means I-ness. Similar to Atman. Atman means the I. If you were talking in Sanskrit, or if you talk in Hindi, that is the popular version of Sanskrit in a way. When you say I'm going to the grocery store, you use the word Atma to refer to yourself. Of course, in philosophy, Atman, for example, in Vedanta, is used to refer to the universal self. When the Buddha says that there is no eternal Atman in ourselves, he's talking about the lower ego. So with the word ego or ego, Blavatsky uses it in a similar way. There is a spiritual I-ness, there is a higher I-ness, and there is a lower I-ness. The lower I-ness is our sense of I am the personality, as we will see. The higher is a purer sense of I-ness, and the spiritual I-ness is a sense of being the whole. So when you see ego or ego, just think of I-ness, not necessarily how psychology uses the idea of ego.
Anything else? No, and that the spiritual entity, the second part of the quote, is not necessarily pure enough or spiritual enough to know or to realize the one with all, which is the Atmic nature in us.
So this is important to understand. This is what we are. When we think about our limitations, we think about our mistakes, or we think about our potentialities. In general, we are thinking about the personality, body, emotions, thoughts, and this is not what we are. After death, we will leave behind this personality, and we will take another one that will be completely different. Maybe my next personality is a woman born in China, and that will be as real a personality as real of a mind personality as Pablo is. So this is just a temporary mask that we take. What we really are is this highly spiritual entity, which needs to incarnate. Why? This is what we are going to explore.
In order to achieve this, to so purify its nature as to finally gain that goal, it can do so only by passing individually and personally, that is, spiritually and physically, through every experience and feeling that exists in the manifold or differentiated universe. So she's telling us here that the soul or the higher ego has to acquire experience both in the higher realms or in the spiritual and the personality or the physical.
Mm-hmm. So even though we are a spiritual entity, as she says, we are not pure enough, awake enough, wise enough, however we want to put it, to realize that we are actually an expression of the universal self. We are a spiritual entity, far more spiritual than what can be expressed through any given personality. But we as the soul need to realize our oneness with all. So in order to be able to do this, we need experience, as Michele said, on the higher planes, on the spiritual planes, and we need experience on the lower planes.
I just wanted to explain the higher nature that we achieve, the individuality that we're going to see next, can only be achieved in the after death states. that was important for me to remember that, we'll see as we go on, but in our physical body, in our personality, we can only do so much. And it's in the after death states that we don't necessarily think as important or as needed, but it really is in order for this to happen.
Yeah, as we are going to see, our physical life is mostly one of gathering experience, and the life after death is one of assimilating that experience. Of course, we also assimilate during life, but it's primarily one of assimilating after death.
Okay, so I put this table in because I really wanted to emphasize or point out the difference between the individuality and the personality, because if you look up the definition of individuality, or our mind, when I think of individuality, my mind thinks of that part that is separate, which is the personality from everything else. So I went to the dictionary, and what I found was down below after the first few definitions, which one of them was personality. The archaic definition of individuality is the quality or state of being indivisible. So to me, this, if I can remember that, this to me is that state where there is no more division, or there is not division at all, as opposed to the personality. In the book, Pablo gives a definition of the individuality as the higher ego, the reflecting dual monad Atma Buddhi. And then HBB calls this
the higher ego that reflects or is a vehicle of the dual monad. As we see there, Atma Buddhi and higher manas is the individuality.
Okay.
Yes, continue.
Yeah. Okay, and HPB calls it the true individual, as opposed to the personality, the persona, the mask, the superficial part that is our nature, or in this incarnation.
So as Michele said, many times we think of the individual in regular speech as the person, but in Theosophy there is a clear difference. The real individual is the soul, the higher ego, and the person is the lower principles, the mind, the emotions, and our body.
So in Pablo's book, what we've done is try to capitalize the word individual to mean this higher part of our being. And then, but he does use, I noticed this when I was reading through it the other day, he does still use the word individual, meaning the separated.
Yeah, if you say individual people, you are using individual in the regular sense, but the individuality. So you always have to keep in mind that the words are always kind of messy.
I think what's good for me, you can go ahead and change. What's good for me is when I start out is to kind of get in context, grab the context or the disclaimers. When I read this, what do I have to remember? So, all right, so here in the course of evolution, the ego must wake up on its own plane and develop self-awareness. So this is the first portion of the talk that we're going to develop. The mission of the higher ego is to shoot out a ray. The mission of the higher ego is to shoot out a ray of itself to the soul in a child. Only then can the higher ego manifest, for thus it manifests through its personal attributes. Only in this way can it gather experience, and the meaning of the passage in the Upanishads where it says that the gods feed on men is the higher ego, is that the higher ego obtains its earth experience through the lower.
Let me just say that all these quotes come from Blavatsky unless otherwise noted. So we don't put her name there. So if you don't see any name, it's HPB's quote.
So the ray is the ray of the higher ego that comes down, and the example is if we had a magnifying glass. So the sun is whole, its beams shine here in California. If we use a magnifying glass, we can get a ray of that. And so that ray is what's shown in the soul of a child.
Yeah, so that ray which seems individual and separated from all the other light of the sun, it's not really separated. It's that because of the magnifying glass, it's concentrated and it looks like it is an entity different from the rest. So there is a part of manas, the principle of mind, that seems to be individual. My manas, your manas. It's not really individual, but it acts as if it was individual. And that part of manas is the one that becomes the soul of a child during incarnation, as HPV says.
We can think of, my mind, my thoughts, my emotions, my sensations, Pablo's thoughts, Pablo's mind, Pablo's emotions. But if we talk to people enough, we notice that the thoughts, the emotions, the feelings, the sensations are the same. They're just flavored different for this personality.
Mm-hmm. So this is necessary to send this individual ray to the child, because as Blavatsky says there, the higher ego needs a certain earth experience that can only be acquired through a physical personality. Many people ask, well, if the higher ego is spiritual and pure, why does it need to go into incarnation? As we saw, there are two things at the beginning of evolution. The higher ego is like a spiritual entity, but it is not aware. It's like asleep, maybe as a baby angel, if you want to think in that way. And it needs the experience on the physical plane to begin to wake up and to develop the sense of I am. And that does it through the personality.
So this is the dual nature of manas, and in non-spiritual people, it is more marked. As evolution goes on, gradually the two become one. It is our spiritual aspiration that we are influenced more by higher manas, or the spiritual nature, in everything we do.
Mm-hmm. So this higher manas is that part of the ego that never really incarnates. And then the ray is what we call the lower manas, which manifests in us as the mind, as what we call mind. And as Michele said, there is at the beginning of evolution a huge difference between us as a soul and the ray of the soul that is our minds. But as evolution proceeds, there is a unification and the soul can manifest more and more through the body.
And this, I don't know if it comes next, this unification, or this happens because of, and I'll just bring it up here, the Antakarana. Okay, that's that bridge or that gap that we've seen. So the higher principles, Atma and Buddhi, are entirely inactive on our physical plane. And the higher ego, Manas, itself is more or less dormant during the waking state of the physical man. This is especially true for the very materialistic mind.
Yeah, so that's what we were saying, that a person is materialistic because the higher ego is not fully awakened and cannot instill spiritual thoughts and aspirations in the personality. So at the beginning of evolution, the ego has very little influence on the personality.
So the idea here, as we saw in the other quote, is, that's all right, is to awaken. We want to awake that higher manas so it can start influencing our actions. So there's two, sorry, I don't know where this quote is, but the thought came to mind. The idea is we want to bring down the spiritual nature of manas, but in order to bring it down, we also have to elevate or bring up our thinking, our feelings, our sensations, our mind, body. So dormant are the spiritual faculties because the ego is so trammeled by matter that it can hardly give all its attention to the actions of the personality, even should the latter commit sins for which that ego, when united with its lower manas, will have to suffer in the future. This first part, because the ego is so trammeled by matter, I always think of, or I use the example of, if our bare hand is the monad, and as it descends into matter, it puts on a glove. When it goes through the mental matter, it puts on a surgical glove. So you still have the nature. You can still feel your hand. You can still pick up things. You can do things that the normal hand can do, only it's a little less sensitive. Then once it goes through the astral matter, you're putting on a winter glove, a wool winter glove. So the sensation or the limitations become more, the sensitivities become less. Then once we descend into the physical plane or the physical matter, it's like putting on a boxing glove. So now we have greater limitations and far less sensitivity in our daily life.
So when we say I, what we are really saying, we are that hand which temporarily is heavily limited by this body, emotions, and these thoughts. Part of the process of evolution, as we are going to see, is to realize that we are the hand and not that we are the boxing glove.
The real ego lives and acts, though on a different plane. The external life is a dream to this ego, while the inner life, or the life on what we call the dream plane, is its real life. So this is, when I first read this, it made me think of all those times that we were dreamy or a daydreaming on the inner planes, and we were always told to snap out of it. Get here, be here now, be aware. And so what we have to do is remember that me, Michele, versus me, the higher ego, are very much in a disconnect. And the idea is to get those connected, to remember that me, the higher ego, is viewing or perceiving this incarnation as more of a play, as an illusion, as a dream.
Mm-hmm. So HPV here says, for us right now, the physical life is real. What happens to my personality is real. If you think most of our problems are problems of our personality, are problems of the body, are problems of the emotion, are problems of the mind, which of course we are using temporarily at this time, but we are none of this. We are going to get rid of that, at what we call death. And we will have a life, a very long life, a far happier, productive, full of love and wisdom life than we can during physical incarnation. But while we are in the body, this seems real, and everything that I'm describing seems maybe like a dream, like something
far off.
Yeah, something, okay, maybe it's a philosophy. When the body's asleep and we come back to our true nature, we realize that reality is the opposite. Everything that is happening on the physical plane is really a dream, because it will be soon gone, and we will remain being what we are, the soul. And that those things that seem dreamy or that seem, not very real, we realize this is my real life. The dream of the physical life will soon be gone, and I will still be here. Of course, that dream has a purpose. There is a purpose why we as souls get into this dream that we call life, and we are going to see what it is. But it's very important to start shifting how we consider ourselves and life, what we consider is real.
Okay, so two things I want to touch on. One is just a reminder that our lives here on Earth is 80, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, and our lives, our after death states, is much, much longer, could last thousands of years. So there's a big difference on it's kind of like eating a meal as opposed to how long our life is. So we gather as we're eating the meal, and then we assimilate in the after death states. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing, when we're talking about dreams, we have to differentiate, or can you designate between the dreams, like when we go to sleep and we dream of being a princess, and that,
and the real,
and the external life, and the ego,
the experience of the
experience,
ego.
Right?
Yeah, that's a complicated subject in itself. Some dreams are just produced by the body, but other dreams that we remember are actually actions that we as a soul are having on the inner planes. What Blavatsky says here is when the body is asleep, we are alive, we have activities, we do a lot of things. The real ego lives and acts, on the inner planes. So even during life, we are much more than our personality. Normally, we think of ourselves as reduced to the personal level. We think that sleeping is a waste of time, as a culture. And Blavatsky says, this is not true. We are very much alive and active and doing important things.
The personal ray, lower manas, is partly pure, partly impure, dragged down by kama, the desires, the passions, on one side, and reaching up towards higher manas on the other. It is a two-faced entity. So sorry, wait a minute.
Yeah. So here we see that the personal ray, again, the idea of the bridges, the lower manas, that is that ray that comes from the soul, has these two aspects, one that is pure and one that is impure. And that's why it can follow one tendency or the other.
And Blavatsky calls it the kama tending aspect or the higher tending aspect. So now this next slide, in the course of evolution, we've talked about waking up on its own plane and developing this self-awareness. And now we're going to talk about expressing itself on the lower planes. And this is where the Antahkarana will come in. So the Antahkarana is therefore that portion of the lower manas, which is one with the higher, the essence which retains its purity. On it are impressed all good and noble aspirations, and in it are the upward energies of lower manas. So this means that for the spiritual influence, like I said, to reach down to our personality, the communication has to go both ways. So the Antahkarana isn't just the bridge that goes one way. There are two ways. It's the source of all good and noble aspirations, and it's the bridge to transfer any valuable personal information or personal experience, I should say, to the higher.
Mm-hmm. So if the lower mind, the ray that comes into the child, was completely let's say, taken over by matter, there would be no hope for a communication with the higher. So Blavatsky says there is an aspect of the ray that retains the purity. It's like the presence of the higher in the lower. And that aspect, which is part of the lower, but it's that part of the lower that is always in tune with the higher. That aspect is, as Michele said, the aspect of our mind that retains the connection with the higher. So it's important to understand what Antahkarana is, when this bridge is active.
And one of the things that helped me was to think of the Antahkarana as an energy or as a verb more than a noun. It's not a bridge like a brick bridge that we walk over. The definition from the book is the upward energies of lower manas, the energies and tendencies which become its devachanic experiences. So it's this movement of energy from the higher to the lower and from the lower to the higher.
Mm-hmm. So Antahkarana is not always active.
It's only active during those moments when lower manas aspires towards a higher half and thus becomes the medium of the communication between the two. So we've talked about that.
Yeah, so every time we aspire, we aspire to do the right thing, we aspire to lead a spiritual life, we aspire to, help. That is the function there is Antahkarana. Blavatsky sometimes calls it manas Antahkarana. The manas, the mind that is aspiring to the higher. So if during our lives we never have those aspirations, the Antahkarana can atrophy. On the contrary, if we try to lead a good life, a spiritual life, a moral life, we are constantly stimulating that Antahkarana and establishing that kind of bridge.
So it seems like when you say the word aspiration, I always think of something that comes from the external that inspires me to do better or to be better. But I think too that it also comes from within. So when we have that feeling of compassion or love, or we can change that jealousy or that condemnation, if we can start in our mind and rationalize it and change it into, oh, this is why I'm doing this, then eventually those inspiring feelings come.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be a feeling. What is important to understand is that in the Theosophical tradition, the personality per se doesn't have spiritual aspirations. From the personality comes the physical nature, our vitality, and the desire nature. When the ray from the soul comes into the body, that ray of the soul is the one that has the potentiality to bring the personality into a spiritual life aspiration. So any effort, even if the effort fails, the effort to do the right thing, the effort to struggle with our negative thoughts and emotions, all that always comes from the higher nature. It cannot come from the lower. It's not in the lower nature. So when we are trying, even if we fail, even if the lower nature wins for the time being, and of course we are putting this in very sharp terms, higher and lower, just to make it clear, we are a unity, ultimately speaking, but this is easy to understand in this way. Any effort toward the right comes from the higher. And the one aspect in us that is trying to follow the higher is the manas antahkarana.
It serves as a medium of communication between the two aspects of manas and conveys from the lower to the higher ego all those personal impressions and thoughts that, by their nature, can be assimilated and stored by the undying entity, and be thus made immortal with it. These being the only elements of the evanescent personality that survive death and time. Therefore, it thus stands to reason that which is only the noble, spiritual, and divine in man can testify in eternity to his having lived. So those non-spiritual, non-noble, non-divine things from our personality, as Pablo said, those are what creates our karma. So those non-noble, non-spiritual, non-divine energies that happened in our past lives are what limit us from our good intentions having success or failure. So we really don't have any control over that. What we have control over is moving in that direction, having karma do its thing, and then continuing forward, because every time we move in the right direction, we create opportunities. Every time we move against this, we lose opportunities, and so our what happens is almost automatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is always that tension between the real creative element that comes from the higher nature and the limitations that our personality imposes on that. Here, this is an important point because, again, with what aspect of our nature do we identify? This is a lot of the spiritual work is where our identification is. When you are trying not to do the wrong thing and you end up doing it, who are you there? Are you the one that failed? Are you the one, the desire, the tendency, or the conditioning toward the wrong? Or are you the one that was trying not to let the personality go in that direction? We need to realize we are that aspiration to do the right thing. If we couldn't do it, it's because of limitations of the past. Because in the past, we have not generated either enough strength or skill, and we have generated this personality that opposes a resistance. But in working with the personality, as Michele said, we are generating a personality that will be more receptive to our true nature, which is trying to do the right thing, for example.
No memory of of a purely daily life function of a physical, egotistical, or of a lower mental nature, such as eating and drinking, enjoying personal sensual pleasures, transacting business to the detriment of others, etc., has aught to do with the higher mind or ego. So this doesn't mean, HBB is telling us here, that all those things that we do on a daily basis don't have any place in Devachan or in our after death states, or have to do with our higher nature. However, it's a question of goals and means. So if our goal is to function in life, our means is to eat properly. But what happens is, what we've seen to have done is we've turned eating into the end result. So our eating needs to be really good, or a big meal, or meals with friends. It's no longer food to get to the goal. It's the goal itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we are going to see, it's not that there is anything wrong in enjoying food with friends, for example. It's what Michele is saying. Do we understand that in order to gather spiritual experience, we need a body and we need to eat? Or eating with friends is the goal of our lives, as Michele was saying. Because remember, if we go back a little to the previous quote, that only those aspects that are spiritual can be assimilated and stored by the undying entity, by the higher ego. So the food that the soul needs for its evolution, the reason why the soul incarnates here is not to have the experience of eating or making money or this or that. The purpose of the soul coming here is to gather all these spiritual aspirations. And those are the ones that will feed the soul after death, let's say. So that's why it is important to understand what's the purpose of life. Do I come here just to have fun, have a pleasure and be comfortable? There is nothing wrong with that, but once that life is over, we as a soul are starved. There is nothing there that was particularly important. Or do I come to gather spiritual experience? Along with that, I may try to have, a nice time, etc. But that becomes secondary to in connection to the goal.
I noticed too, and I think this is like an evolutionary path, that I noticed that kids in their 20s have no concept of or their concept is gaining stuff. They see, oh, I need to have a job, I need to have more education, I need to get a house, I need to do this. And my kids are in their 20s. So when I talk to them about, well, no, that's not the goal, that's not the end result, I can see that it just doesn't register. They're like, what are you talking about? But as they get a little older, I can see that, okay, I understand that, it's not just consuming, but there is a different goal, or there can be a different end there.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is not to say that daily life is useless. Daily life is what will feed the soul. So this is a quote from one of the masters talking about the value of daily life when we approach it spiritually.
Right, that's what I was going to say. This is probably my favorite quote as a wake up. Because Master KH says here, does it seem to you a small thing that the past year has been spent only in your family obligations? Nay, what better cause for reward? What better discipline than the daily and hourly performance of duty? Believe me, my pupil, the man or woman who is placed by karma in the midst of small plain duties and sacrifices and loving kindness will, through these faithfully fulfilled, rise to the larger measure of duty, sacrifice, and charity to all humanity. What better path towards the enlightenment you are striving after than the daily conquest of the self, the perseverance in spite of want of visible psychic progress, the bearing of ill fortune, with that serene fortitude, which turn it to spiritual advantage. So when we see the qualifications or the in the paramitas or the anything in Christianity, it's not there. Nowhere is success. Nowhere is the word or the words that say be here, have this, do this. It's all discrimination. It's endurance. It's patience. It's tolerance. It's love. Those are the qualifications that we hope to have more strength in towards the end of our journey here on this with this personality. So success isn't what's important. It's doing what's been given to us, what's right in front of us on a daily basis.
So this is again a question of who you think you are. You know, if at the end of the life we look at the life of a person and that person was successful and was a president and had influenced many people and had money and founded, you know, foundations, you say, wow, that's a great life. But if that life is limited to that, after that life is over, the soul has nothing. For the soul, that's a waste of time. Another person, an obscure life, but a person that was silently serving others, maybe it's the family, and trying to do the right thing and trying to realize his or her true nature. After that life is over, that somebody who doesn't know that person said, what a waste of life, you know, unknown, didn't do anything remarkable. For the soul, that soul took advantage of that life. So we have to always keep in mind, who are we really? Because otherwise, we just waste our time.
And serving isn't necessarily serving others, going out and feeding the poor, or serving is, to me, is doing the best that you can every day with what's right in front of you. That to me is serving. And I think we get confused when we think, oh, I'm not giving to charity, or I'm not taking in the homeless, stuff like that.
Yeah, again, you know, it may seem impressive, a person that is sending millions of dollars to Africa, but if that person does it just because that person is full of himself to write off taxes, again, for the soul, that means nothing. And a person that, you know, most of his or her life was in serving even the family or the neighborhood or friends, that is important for the soul.
Right. And I mentioned this, go ahead. And I mentioned this just because this is where most of us are. That is our service, is just doing what's right in front of us, the very best that we can, you know, every day.
So far we had the soul, the ego has to wake up on its own plane, has to develop a self-awareness, and has to learn how to impress itself on the personality through the antahkarana. And then the personality begins to lead a spiritual life, and all that spiritual activity is food for the soul, begins to be assimilated by the soul. So that is the evolution that takes place through the personality. That is what Blavatsky said, that the soul needs to go personally through the manifold universe. But there is another aspect of the evolution of the soul that we know very little, that is what the soul is doing on its own plane, which is the soul is, as manas, is trying to unite itself to the higher principles, Atman and Buddhi.
Before you go on, I want to, because you gave a nice summary of 1, 2, and 3, I want to plug in the book. The second half is on practice, and this is what it's about. It's about what we can do in our daily life, meditation, our daily, how we go about our daily life with awareness. I call it, you know, moving meditation throughout the day. How many times do we tap back in to that awareness, or are we just moving blindly? So the second part of the book is 4 chapters on exercises that will help our daily life be more productive, so that when it comes time to unite with the higher principles, we're kind of ready and we're there. Okay, so this is the same one that we've seen before. We just highlighted what we're talking about is Buddhi as the spiritual soul. And so we've highlighted this section. So remember that the spiritual soul is different from the spiritual ego. So the spiritual ego is that self-awareness. It's that connection with manas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will see that this is part of so far we described what takes place at the manasic level. Now we will see the relationship between manas and buddhi.
Okay, this is just to show this. I just wanted to show the individuality and the personality because some of the quotes really talk about the individuality. So now we're talking here. Sorry, I keep thinking you can see my hand. We're talking here, as Pablo said, higher ego and the spiritual ego. Buddhi is the spiritual soul. When this aspect is developed and united with the human soul manas, it becomes spiritual self-consciousness, the spiritual ego. Buddhi per se is a passive and latent principle, the spiritual vehicle of Atman. It can have neither self-consciousness nor mind. It becomes conscious by what it accretions, by what is accretions it gets from manas after every new incarnation and the death of man.
So here we see how Blavatsky talks about the need for a union between buddhi and manas. Manas is the source of self-consciousness, self-awareness. The sense of I-ness doesn't come from Kama, doesn't come from buddhi, doesn't come from Atman. The sense of I-ness comes from manas. Now, that sense of I-ness, when it identifies with desires and with the body, is I am Pablo. But when that sense of I-ness begins to identify itself with buddhi, buddhi, as we will see, is a universal aspect of our being. So it becomes I am the whole, I am the totality, I am the oneness. So when our sense of I-ness is transferred to buddhi, now buddhi, that was a passive soul, spiritual soul, now becomes an active vehicle of consciousness or center of consciousness, the spiritual ego.
So what we're seeing here is the moving from I am the personality to the higher ego, which I am, and then up to the Buddhic level, which I am the whole.
Yeah, so there is a process of purification of the sense of I-ness that is necessary. This is what you were talking about.
Yes. So we see the lower ego, kama manas, is the sense of I am Michele or I am Pablo. The higher ego, the higher manas is I am a ray. Okay, I am this part.
Yeah, it's like a more abstract sense of I exist without identifying with a limited thing. You know, it's not I am Pablo. It's just that pure sense of being, of existing, that pure self-awareness. That is the higher manas.
And then the spiritual ego, buddhi manas, where I am the whole. Because we have to remember that buddhi is a universal principle. Okay, and it's through this connection that it gets the I amness or I-ness. The portion of the fifth principle, manas, okay, and this only its purest and most abstract attributes, is necessary for the retention of a divine spiritualized notion of the I in the monad, which would otherwise have no consciousness in relation to the object and subject at all.
So the monad per se doesn't have a sense of I-ness and doesn't have consciousness as we understand it. Consciousness is always dualistic. I am aware of something else. And so the monad doesn't have that. Blavatsky would talk about the monad has is in a state of conscious non-consciousness. You know, in some philosophies, they call it pure awareness, whatever name we put it. But the sense of consciousness, the self-conscious idea of being a monad comes by absorbing the highest, purest aspect of manas, the most unselfish aspect of manas. And that is what makes the higher ego grow into a spiritual ego, from higher manas into a buddhi manas.
So the spiritual ego, buddhi manas, reflects no varying states of consciousness. It is independent of all sensation or experience. It does not think, it knows, by an intuitive process only faintly conceivable to the average man. This is those flashes of inspiration or flashes of geniusness. The spiritual ego at this level, buddhi manas, there's no thinking, there's no feeling, there's this quiet awareness that perceives everything, that perceives the essence of it. And this is what we've heard called spiritual intuition or spiritual wisdom.
Mm-hmm. So at the level of buddhi manas, when we have a glimpse of buddhi manas, then it manifests, as Michele says, as those insights. At the level of buddhi manas, outside of the body, let's say, there is this knowingness. Blavatsky says that the spiritual ego is omniscient, not in the sense that it knows everything, but in the sense that whatever the spiritual ego perceives, it perceives it as it is. It perceives the truth of it, as opposed to what we perceive here through the brain, where we see only shadows or appearances.
Or colored, we see it colored.
Mm-hmm.
Only when the true discerning or discriminating power is set free is illusion overcome, and setting free of that power is the union of manas with buddhi, the attainment of the adeptship. It is only when the union is completed in the living human being that delusion is at an end. Here, there seems to be a little bit of a paradox or a contradiction in the sense that the only way that this union, buddhi manas, can be made is during human evolution. But it's so pure, it's so spiritual that us as regular humans don't get there as quickly as we think we do, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, Blavatsky talks about, we don't have time to talk about this aspect. We are coming to an end, but she talks about a temporary union between manas and buddhi that she called it manas taijasa, the mind illumined by buddhi temporarily. In the adept, buddhi and manas are always working together. There is a union. This is the spiritual ego. That means that whenever the mind works, it works illumined by buddhi. In our spiritual practice and life, we get closer and closer to buddhi so that we begin to have those moments in which the mind is illumined.
Oh, very good. Very good. All right. So that is the end of our talk. And we just wanted, I apologize, but we just want to plug Pablo's book here. I know Barry said that he has about 3 copies there. And so you can contact him to get the book. But the TS in Amsterdam also has a supply of the book, both in paperback and they also have hard copy. So we have an ebook on our website at fohaproductions.com. And there also is a free companion guide where I went chapter by chapter and get definitions, discussion questions, meditations, all that kind of stuff. So it could be studied either individually or within a large group. So I apologize again for the promotion. You didn't we didn't exactly get to wrap up. I looked at the time and I panicked. So.
Oh, don't worry. That's fantastic. What an amazing presentation. We are so lucky to have you.